Good morning, everyone. My name is Arsine Grigoryan, and I'm one of the attorneys from the Center for Truth and Justice. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I primarily do class action litigation. I have the immense honor of introducing today's keynote speaker, a man who doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Geoffrey Robertson is founder and head of Doughty Street Chambers, the UK's largest human rights practice. He served as counsel in many leading cases in constitutional, criminal, and international law. He served as president of the UN War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone, where he authored landmark decisions in a variety of critical issues, including the illegality of recruiting child soldiers. In 2008, he was appointed by the Secretary General as one of 3 distinguished jurist members of the UN Justice Council. In 2015, 100 years after the Armenian genocide, Geoffrey Robertson, along with Amal Clooney, represented Armenia in the European Court of Human Rights in the matter of Perenchek versus Switzerland. Now, this was a freedom of speech case where it involved a Turkish nationalist who was also a member of the Talat Pasha Committee and known for publicly denying the Armenian genocide. So what happened was Armenia intervened as a third party in that matter, and ultimately Geoffrey Robertson and Amal Clooney were successful in showing that the lower court's comments were highly inappropriate, one, because they were outside of the jurisdiction to state as such, but also because the Armenian genocide did in fact occur. Now, Geoffrey Robertson's advocacy goes beyond the courtroom. When he is not arguing cases, he seeks to educate through writing. In 2009, he authored a piece entitled, "Was There an Armenian Genocide?" He has published many books, including Crimes Against Humanity, The Struggle for Global Justice, The Case of the Pope, The Statue of Liberty, and of course, An Inconvenient Genocide. Who now remembers the Armenians? And what is particularly special about this book is anyone can read it. It's written in a clear and concise manner, and not just for lawyers. So I highly recommend it if any of you can get your hands on this book. But books take time to research, draft, edit, and publish. So when times are urgent, Geoffrey Robertson turns to media. On September 27, 2020, Armenians in Artsakh, Armenia, and all over the world were devastated and scrambling to get any sort of media coverage they can on the war. Spoiler alert, we weren't very successful, but a few days after September 27, Geoffrey Robertson published a piece condemning the acts of Azerbaijan and Turkey. Now, when I was a little girl and somebody put it in my head that I should become an attorney, I thought it was sort of a simple process. Step 1, you take the right side. Step 2, you gather your evidence, and then you go to court, and then justice is served with a bow on top. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But I say this to state that when we look at attorneys like Geoffrey Robertson, who work tirelessly, it is inspiring. And it is important to know that there is always a voice that will stand up for human rights. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Geoffrey Robertson, all the way from Australia, and whom I admire. We look forward to your talk. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Dini. It's a great privilege for me to open your important conference, a conference even more important, I guess, than you realized when you planned it, because human rights in the aftermath of war, bringing to accountability those guilty of perpetrating the worst human right of all, the mass murder of people, of civilians and children, which happened, of course, in the 44-day war, has now been overtaken by what is the 3-month and continuing war in Ukraine. This has raised questions, and interestingly enough, they were questions that were raised in September 2020 and were not addressed And the failure to address them is now being seen in the killings by Russian forces, the aggression, the war crimes that are being perpetrated in Ukraine, and the failure of the Security Council to deal with them. This is a failure in a mechanism that was set up at the end of the Second World War and which has served us reasonably well. But it cannot serve us well any longer, so long as Russia, the purported, the false protector of Armenia, is a member of the Security Council, a member which is led by an international criminal and which commits an international crime that the Security Council was set up to combat and to prevent. I'll address a few remarks about the future in relation to war crimes and the crime of aggression towards the end of this discussion, and I welcome questions because it's a very unsettled question. Other issues that are relevant to your discussion are settled, and I'll say a word about the old chestnut of whether genocide was committed by the Ottoman forces back in 1915. I consider that that is now settled and that the issue is really unarguable, other, of course, than by Turkey, that whose argument has dwindled to very little. Then I shall talk about the 44-day war, not in the detail that you plan to analyze in this conference, but I shall talk about it in the context of the inability of the Security Council to do its duty, and its duty was to protect the peace, and it did nothing. So that is the basis upon which I offer these thoughts as an introduction to your important conference. Beginning first with genocide, it's a word that is much overused, and I draw attention to its legal definition because it has been used whenever there has been a degree of killing and the speaker wishes to ramp up hostility against the perpetrator. What is, it's been alleged, for example, by the US president even, that what is happening in Ukraine is genocide. Well, it's not genocide, because genocide in its actual definition in the Genocide Convention requires proof of an intention to destroy a group on account of their race or religion by killing a substantial part of them or by deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole and in part. Now, that is precisely what the Ottomans did to 1 million or so Armenians in 1915. But genocide, and let's keep it because it's the worst crime against humanity, was bandied about loosely and still is about the Ukraine. What Putin seeks to do in the Ukraine is not to destroy Ukrainians, but to subjugate them. And that's a different matter. So while I consider that Mr. Putin himself is guilty of the crime of aggression, and while I consider that he bears command responsibility for a number of war crimes. I do not think that there is any question that he is guilty of genocide. Let's keep genocide to its actual definition in law, because it's the worst crime, and let's not bandy the word about loosely. I don't consider that China is committing genocide against the Uyghurs. It's treating them so harshly that it amounts to the crime of persecution. That is a lesser crime although it's perhaps invidious to talk of crimes in this magnitude in order of their severity. It is nonetheless persecuting them, but it is not destroying them. What happened in 1915 in Armenia was the destruction of people on account of their race and religion. And the historical evidence has now, I think, established that beyond any reasonable doubt. Of course, there were an interesting book written recently about the Adana massacres. There were massacres in the 1880s, the Hamidian attacks, but it was not until a few years before the First World War that the language of genocide began appearing in Ottoman publications, microbes, cockroaches, the general subhuman mythology that we see in cases of genocide. Then we had the seizure of Armenian properties. We had the forcing Armenians out of their homes onto the death marches, liquidating their companies, sending them off to Aleppo in the knowledge that they would be destroyed, and with the wish to destroy them as a result of many years of building up of hatreds on the ground of race itself because of their successes, on the ground of religion. The numbers killed with the cry, Allah is great, showed that there was a religious dimension to the mass murders. But it was in 1915 declared by France and Russia and Britain to be a crime against humanity. That is when the very phrase crime against humanity enters international law. But as Winston Churchill said, it was a crime without a name, because in fact it was not an international law crime for a state to kill its own people. That was the problem that the Holocaust eventually forced the world to answer with the Genocide Convention. There was, according to the law of the time, international law, there was not, a state could do what it liked to its own people. And there was no international criminal law at that time. And Britain, I have to say, was first and the only state that was actually prepared to deliver on its promise to punish the perpetrators of what we can now call the Armenian genocide. It took them 67 of them, of the Young Turk leaders, to Malta with the objective of trying them and punishing them for the various elements of various mass murders that were committed. And they couldn't. The lawyers then discovered that there was nothing in international law that permitted individuals ordered by their government to kill citizens of their own country on racial or religious grounds because they were obeying the law, they were obeying the legal authorities of the time. So that was meant that the 67 identified serious perpetrators of the Armenian genocide had to be sent back to Turkey, where of course they were welcomed by Arafat, and there was no prosecution that followed. So the evidence, as I say, is overwhelming. I summarized it in the book that I wrote about the genocide, proving against all the claims of Turkish-inspired or funded historians that it did exist. The evidence is palpable from German missionaries, from German consuls, from the allies of the Ottomans at the time, who were pretty horrified about what was going on, from the American consuls and ambassador there. So at the end of the day, it is proved beyond reasonable doubt. Even the Pope in 2014 declared it the first genocide of the 20th century. Of course, popes are not infallible, and it wasn't the first genocide, it was in fact the second, the first being the mass murder of the Herero people in Namibia in 2005. And the years after that by the Germans, including led by Hermann Goering's grandfather. So leaving history aside, there is no doubt. Of course, what prompted the major countries to resist acknowledging the genocide was Turkey's importance and Turkey's neuralgia over having the Ottomans, their predecessors, accused of genocide. It's quite interesting that when I wrote the book, I was surprised at the reason why Britain, which was the country most concerned about the genocide back in 1915, which tried to punish it, where you have Churchill and Lloyd George, its great leaders, denouncing the genocide with such emphasis, why its parliament did not step up to the plate. And so, under the Freedom of Information Act in Britain, I obtained the reasons for that which were secret memoranda circulated in the British Foreign Office. And those memoranda said in terms, our attitude to this question is unethical in not recognizing the genocide, in saying that there is not sufficiently unequivocal evidence for it. Our attitude, they admitted behind the scenes, is unethical. But Turkey is neuralgic on the subject, and neuralgic is a very good word to describe the absurd lengths to which Turkey went to punish, to denounce any who objected, any who described the behavior of the Ottomans as genocide. But the importance of Turkey to us, the British Foreign Office went on secretly, economically and strategically, means that we have no other option. Well, that was the position of Britain, and it was the position of the United States. President Obama, of course, promised to recognize the genocide. When he became president, he simply called it Medjugorje, the great tragedy. And it was concern at this NATO ally being furious, expelling diplomats, going to extreme lengths. When Australian parliaments threatened to recognize the genocide, Turkey indicated it would ban their members from going to Gallipoli, which was where so many Australians died in the trenches in the First World War. So, and was of course an important part of the story, because it was the Allied appearance off Gallipoli on the 24th of April 1915 that sparked the destruction of the Armenian intellectuals, which was the opening, the prelude to the following genocide. So that was the position until this year, when President Biden took the step, finally, of recognizing what happened in 1915 as genocide. And of course, Turkey meekly accepted that characterization, or at least did not object in the way that was expected. So I think that Britain will now follow in the footsteps of America and recognize, as it certainly should, the Armenian genocide. Now, that's been a long battle, and there are aspects of the Turkish recalcitrance and reluctance to accept the genocide term that undoubtedly inspired an anti-Armenian policy, and that inspired a linkage with Aliyev and the Azeri regime in the 44-day war. We can see that in the, and that no doubt you'll be examining the evidence of Turkish cooperation and aggression. And of course, you see it in the details of Turkish companies that contracted with Syrian mercenaries to fight in the war. There is a good deal of evidence of Turkish guilt of the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression being the invasion of a sovereign country without the justification of self-defense. There was no threat to Azerbaijanis in Nagorno-Karabakh or anywhere else at the time in September 2020, when the 44-day war was started, undoubtedly by Azerbaijan in conjunction or with the support made clear from the beginning and made clear in many respects, which are the subject of evidence in the following weeks. So that was, in my view, a crime of aggression. And what happened? Certainly there were countries were diverted in their attention by the developing AIDS crisis, developing coronavirus crisis, but they were not, emphatically not, blinded or blindsided. Of course, there was propaganda on behalf of Aliyev and on behalf of Turkey, but there was nothing to stop the action by the Security Council to do its duty and preserve the peace. Nothing other than the Russian veto. Why would Russia veto the protection of a country with which Russia itself has a security treaty? Well, that's a question that, among many, the Armenian government must ponder. Russia as a fickle friend, Russia as a betrayer of the peace, Russia as an international criminal, as now appears, and yet Russia, the country that has Armenia's back, the country that right from the beginning has betrayed it. Go back to 1921, when Stalin made Armenia, instead of giving Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia, made it an oblast, so-called, a independent state under the sovereignty of Azerbaijan. That was the basis for the Security Council resolution of 1993 that has so affected this issue. The Security Council, 3 resolutions in 1993 that the Armenians in the Nagorno-Karabakh region are citizens of the Azerbaijani Republic. On that basis, no country in the world will recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as either independent or as part of Armenia. And that resolution was made by the Security Council without the slightest historical or legal inquiry. It seems to me clear that this is a perversion of the truth, that without any inquiry, and indeed at the time, 1993, it was said in order to encourage a ceasefire. In fact, Nagorno-Karabakh satisfies the criteria for independent statehood rather better than some recognized states. If you go back into history, Artsakh is clearly a country that is distinguished by more than its carpets, by its intellectual and religious life between the 10th century and the 17th century. When it was annexed by Russia in 1805, it was overwhelmingly Armenian. It was, there was a survey, actually, a very detailed one in 1823, which showed Armenians in the great majority. And when in 1923, I think, the fate was finally settled for Nagorno-Karabakh being part of Azerbaijan, probably at the request of Ataturk, it really had 94% of its population were ethnic Armenians. And that overwhelming majority was still the case in the 1980s, when 75%, less, I suppose, than 1923, but that was because of transmigration encouraged by the government in Baku. But when you look at the, as I have, at the 1987 pogroms in Sumgait and the persecution and the crimes committed against Armenians in that period, in the lead up to the war, you see that there was reason for the votes in Stepanakert to secede. The initial votes of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh were to join Armenia, to be part of Armenia. It's one of the tragedies that that never took place, that instead the next vote was to secede. But nonetheless, when you look at the behavior of the Azeris in Operation Ring and in the various examples of violence and discrimination to which Armenians were subjected, and of course the siege of Stepanakert. I've described that as Guernica writ small. It really was a war crime of the first order, as hospitals and schools and other civilian targets were shelled and 2,000 civilians were killed. So we have now, since 1993, for 25 years, a stable and settled local democracy in Nagorno-Karabakh of ethnic Armenians. And I conducted a survey some 10 years ago in which I concluded that the lawyers and judges of Nagorno-Karabakh were independent of Armenian influence, and that there was not only a strong argument for Nagorno-Karabakh's right to self-determination, it had always had that element of anonymity, but there was also a right to remedial secession. And I wrote an opinion about this particular right, which belongs to a people that are a discernible minority in a state who have been subjected to criminal acts, to human rights abuses, and to oppression, severe oppression. And it is called, and I don't want to go into international legal jargon, but it is a fundamental right by abuse of sovereign power, where the majority abuses their control of government to subject a clear established minority to abuse, then other things being equal, there is the right to secede, the right to remedial secession, to remedy the human rights abuses that are taking place. East Timor is an example of the right to remedial secession when they were granted independence from Indonesian sovereignty. Kosovo is another example. So I think that analyzing the human rights abuses suffered from the pogrom in Sumgait and Baku, from Operation Ring, from the Stepanakert siege, there is in Nagorno-Karabakh a right to remedial secession. Of course, there was the Minsk process, which didn't go very far, partly because of the refusal of the Azeris to accept Nagorno-Karabakh as a party to that process. And then I've already mentioned the build-up to the war in September of 2020. So, and the failure of Russia to protect Armenia despite its treaty, which it claims, of course, does not extend to protecting Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. So, in order to consider the accountability for human rights abuses in the aftermath of war, we come back to the cloud that has been put over international law by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There is no doubt that Putin bears, beyond any reasonable doubt, is guilty of the crime of aggression, because he's invaded a sovereign state without any claim of acting in self-defense against an imminent threat from Ukraine. That's nonsense, although it's nonsense that he has frequently uttered. He's also guilty, I think, of war crimes, not that he has known of them or planned them or participated in them, but because he has failed to take any action. Under the command responsibility principle of the International Criminal Court, a commander is not only responsible for crimes he's ordered, but for crimes that he has failed to investigate and punish. And the president of Russia is entirely insouciant about the crimes, about any kind of retribution or even investigation of the crimes that have been committed by attacking and killing civilians. Children, over 200 have been killed so far. And of course, the bombing of schools and hospitals. So there it is. What can be achieved when there is war crime committed by and on behalf of a state which is a guarantor of the United Nations. Russia is one of 5 that are superpowers in the sense that they can veto any United Nations action. So that is the concern that I have. I can talk further about command responsibility if you're interested in that, and the question of command responsibility of all the crimes that were committed in the course of the 44-day war. But I see that I've now exceeded the time, and I'm very happy to answer questions. But I do commend to you the thought that the failure to deal with the 44-day war at a Security Council level presaged perhaps the end of the Security Council. How long can we subscribe to an international organization whose whole rationale is to guarantee the peace when, as with the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, as with the war in Ukraine, is it time to replace it by perhaps what H.G. Wells called an assembly of parliamentary peoples that exclude Russia, certainly, because it breached international law? Is it time for Armenia to look at its so-called protector and to sever the links with a criminal state that have so benighted certainly its future? They are issues that we might consider discussing in the course of the next 2 days.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robertson. Now, before we dive into the Q&A session, it is my pleasure to award Geoffrey Robertson with the Lifetime Achievement Award. I don't know if you can see it, but this, great. This award is, well, you know, it says Center for Truth and Justice Lifetime Achievement Award presented to Geoffrey Robertson. So this award is given to an individual who has shown an unwavering commitment in contributing to the betterment of Armenia and Artsakh throughout their career. You have made substantial contributions to Armenia and Artsakh throughout your career as a human rights lawyer and advocate. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for the work that you do for us, as well as all people around the world.
Thank you very much. I was afraid that you were going to present me with a bottle of mulberry liqueur from Nagorno-Karabakh, which I'm obliged to drink whenever I go there.
So I actually, as many of you might know, this is being streamed worldwide. Certainly a lot of lawyers in California are watching right now, as well as in Europe. So we do have questions both from the audience here and through the chat function. The first question is the West not equally guilty of failure to protect, especially by established democracies in a region covered by dictators?
Yeah, I think that is what we must now recognize. And this seems to me the crisis of international law, and certainly the crisis of international diplomacy at the moment, that we have a system that was set up in 1945 at the San Francisco Conference, adopted a mechanism whereby the Security Council would be the guarantor of protection of citizens from being killed and mutilated in war. And now, unfortunately, the use of the superpower veto as part of that mechanism and the commitment to war of a member of the 5 guarantors of peace has rendered the United Nations useless for its purpose. The League of Nations failed, and so the United Nations was put together as a way of ensuring that the future world organization was capable of intervening and protecting. And of course, for many years, that it seemed to work. The veto was not over-exercised. But in our time, we have seen the veto exercised by Russia, by China, and by the United States. Those 3 countries have refused to go along with the majority, with the unanimous, other than them, Security Council. One saw that, I suppose, in the case of Assad, who killed some 400,000 of his own people and was protected at every stage when Britain tried to have the International Criminal Court investigate him. Russia, of course, vetoed it. There are other instances. America covered itself with whatever the alternative to glory is over Rwanda. When it refused, it stopped the United Nations from intervening to stop the butchery that cost 900,000 lives, pretending, as did Britain, that it wasn't genocide. There are many inglorious examples, but now we have to face the alternative, the fact that if Russia can get away with breaching international law in such an obvious way as the invasion of Ukraine and the continuing war there, then how can we realistically or rationally consider the Security Council as a guarantor of peace?
Thank you for that response. I also have a really good question here, is how can the people of Artsakh defend their rights if their country isn't recognized and Azerbaijan doesn't allow international organizations to enter the occupied areas?
Yeah, I agree. That's what I said, I think, in mentioning the fact that it was Azerbaijan right from the beginning of the Minsk process back in the 1990s, which refused to allow Nagorno-Karabakh to be represented. This was a process that was intended to assure its future of peace and to avoid the, I think it's terrible that every young Karabakian has to serve in the army. But that was the idea of the Minsk process. But Russia and France, who were parties to the Minsk process, did not support Armenia's request for Nagorno-Karabakh to be represented. So that was, I think, blame that should be shared by the other parties. So how can the Minsk process succeed without Nagorno-Karabakh's representation? A few years ago, I did a survey in Nagorno-Karabakh of the legal profession. I interviewed the judges and lawyers and so on. I was quite satisfied that it was, and the politicians and civil society. And my report was quite satisfied that it was independent and that it was a proper and representative state. And yet the shadow of those 1993 resolutions passed without any examination, merely to hasten a ceasefire by buttering up the Azerbaijanis, conceding their case without scrutiny in order to persuade them of a need of a ceasefire. That has had this dramatic and even devastating to any prospect of progress result that Nagorno-Karabakh is seen as having no sort of independence at all and no right to speak for the 170,000 Armenians who are citizens of it.
And we talk quite a bit about Turkey, and as you mentioned, and as is well known, Turkey played a huge role in the 44-day war. And so is there a way that Turkish President Erdogan and Aliyev as well can be held accountable for such crimes?
Yes, in the long run, there are legal actions that can be taken once the evidence is clear. The examples of Turkey being involved in the crime of aggression would need to be examined. I think at the moment, the evidence that I've seen shows without doubt that Turkish companies acted as paymasters of mercenaries, and that there was use of Turkish munitions, but there has to be clear evidence, and so whether action can be taken, certainly it can be taken against those Turkish companies, and I'm surprised that it hasn't.
And this is a question regarding your earlier comments about China and the Uyghur situation. The question is, can you explain why that does not meet the qualifying criteria of genocide with forced sterilization and cultural distinction? So is it a scale or a lack of one or more elements?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm fairly certain in my own mind as a lawyer, because the man who invented, if you like, or who named, when Churchill said that mass murder of your own people is a crime without a name, the brilliant fellow who named it was called Raphael Lemkin. And incidentally, he always regarded the Armenian genocide as being the most obvious case of genocide until the Holocaust. But he was excluded. He wanted his original draft of the Genocide Convention included cultural genocide. It included genocide that would strip a race, religion of its cultural property, of its beliefs, and he made it rather akin to what the Chinese seem to be doing with the Uyghurs. But when the convention came up for approval by the General Assembly in 1948, that aspect of the definition was stripped away, and genocide became the intention to destroy a people or part of a significant part of the people by reason of race or religion. So it became a much clearer but narrower definition. And what the Chinese appear to be doing to the Uyghurs is not destroying them as a people, but brainwashing them, I think, in one sense, and persecuting them, subjecting them to all sorts of special conditions that are not applicable to the Chinese Han people. So I draw the line there, and I don't think that the evidence that I've seen amounts to genocide. It does amount to the crime of persecution.
Mr. Robertson, we all know you're a very busy man, so we really thank you for being here with us. The last question I'd like you to address is, what advice do you have for Armenians all over the world?
Get rid of Russia. It's the albatross around Armenia's neck. And I know that this is a problem. It's a problem for Serbia as well, which has this sense that Russia is the only big country that has its back, to use the phrase. But ever since Stalin gave away Nagorno-Karabakh to the Azeris back in 1923, Russia has very often been the problem. When you look at the arms sales, it has paid, it has sold Armenia, it has sold the Azeris the weapons with which they've killed Armenians. Yes, it sold Armenia the same weapons at a discount, but that does not, and it did not in that crucial time in 1988, it did not do what it could have done and rectify the situation. It has allowed its friendship, its contracts, its between the Russian oligarchs and the Azeri oil and gas magnates to define its I think, its failure to protect Armenia. I don't think it's genuine. And I think now, hard as it may be, and it's hard for other countries with who have been supported by Russia over the years, but who now are faced with declaring Russia a criminal state, which it is in legal terms, in my view. And I think the time has come for states to do what is right rather than what is convenient. So that would be my advice. And I know it would be hard to take, but nonetheless, the time has come to declare before more children, before more civilians are killed in Ukraine, that Russia is a criminal state that must be rejected in terms of any support.
Mr. Robertson, thank you very much.